Hey guys, this is Dawson Discussions, and my name is Nathan L. Dawson Jr. This video is an introductory to a video series that I'm going to make concerning black wealth and the importance of black economic empowerment in the United States of America. This upcoming video series, I will discuss the history of the black wealth in the United States of America from the beginning all the way up until today, how I myself go about building wealth in my household, and the importance of having a national black economic empowerment plan, so stay tuned. So the racial wealth gap refers to substantial difference in wealth held by white and Asian households in the United States as compared to the vastly lower levels of wealth held by black households. The Institute for Policy Studies and Corporation for Economic Development notes that it will take 228 years for the average black family to amass the same level of wealth average which the average white family holds today. So, according to the 2016 survey of consumer finances, the median white household has a net worth of $171,000, which is at least 10 times the net worth of the median black household of $17,100. In other words, black households are overrepresented among the poor and working class and underrepresented among the upper middle class and the wealthy. So, how did we get here? Well, centuries of discrimination and exploitation have left black Americans much poorer than white Americans. So, as I said a few moments ago, the median white household has a net worth of 10 times that of the median black household. So, the books on the subject is one book, Black Labor, White Wealth, The Search for Power and Economic Justice. And also another book is The Color of Money, Black Banks, and the Racial Wealth Gap by Marcia Baradaran. So essentially, while free African Americans own around $50 million by 1860, farm tenancy and sharecropping replaced slavery after the American Civil War because newly freed African American farmers did not own land or supplies, and they had to depend on white Americans who rented the land and supplies out to them. Essentially, sharecropping is a legal arrangement with regard to agricultural land in which a landowner allows a tenant to use the land in return for a share of the crops produced on that land. Sharecropping was a way for poor farmers, both white and black, to earn a living from land owned by someone else. The landowner provided land, housing, tools, and seed, and perhaps even a mule, and a local merchant provided food and supplies on credit. At harvest time, the sharecropper received a share of the crop, from 1/3 to 1/2, with landowner taking the rest of the crops. The cropper used his share to pay off his debt and to pay off his debt to the merchant. And at the same time, Southern blacks were trapped in debt and denied banking services, while white citizens were given much lower interest loans to set up farms in the Midwest and the Western United States. White homesteaders were able to go west and obtain unclaimed land through government grants, while the land grants and rights of African Americans were rarely enforced. So the Homestead Acts were several laws in the United States by which an applicant could acquire ownership of government land or the public domain, typically called a homestead. In all, more than 160 million acres of public land, or nearly 10% of the total area of the United States, was given away to 1.6 million homesteaders. Most of the homesteads were west of the Mississippi River. The first of the acts, the Homestead Act of 1862, opened up millions of acres. Any adult who had never taken up arms against the federal government of the United States could apply. Women and immigrants who had applied for citizenship were eligible. But the 1866 Act explicitly did include black Americans and encouraged them to participate. But rampant discrimination, systematic barriers, and bureaucratic inertia slowed down black gains. According to Paul Framer in his 2017 book, Building an American Empire, the Era of Territorial and Political Expansion. Historian Michael Lanza argued that while the 1866 law was not as beneficial as it might have been, it was part of the reason that by 1900, 1/4 of all Southern black farmers owned their own farms. Also, according to Melvin L. Oliver and Thomas M. Shapiro in their 1997 book, Black Wealth, White Wealth, A New Perspective on Racial Inequality, on pages 14 and 15. So, after the Civil War, the Freedmen's Bank helped to foster wealth among African Americans. At the end of the American Civil War, the poor economic conditions of the formerly enslaved freedmen were aggravated by the economic devastation of the southern states. The newly freed blacks had very few economic resources or capital, and even less exposure to the private enterprise. Many soon turned to sharecropping and forced labor in the South. To help alleviate their socio-economic conditions, the Republican-controlled U.S. Congress established the Freedmen's Bureau, passing an act of incorporation and a charter for the Freedmen's Savings and Trust Company, which was signed into law by Republican President Abraham Lincoln on March 3, 1865. However, it failed in 1874, partially because of suspicious, high-risk loans to white banks and the Panic of 1873. This lowered the support of African Americans had to the open business and to acquire wealth, capital, and resources. In addition, after the bank failed, taking the assets of many African Americans with it, many African Americans started to not trust banks. There was also the threat of lynching to any African American who achieved success in the South. Examples of explicit and public opposition to African American economic success have diminished since the Civil Rights Movement. But however, before this period of American transition, there were a few notable violent attacks against prosperous African American communities, including the Tulsa Race Riot and the Roswell Massacre. The Tulsa Race Massacre took place on May 31st and June 1st, 1921, when mobs of white residents, many of them deputized and given weapons by city officials, attacked black residents and businesses of the Greenwood District in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It has been called the single worst incident of racial violence in American history. The attack, carried out on the ground and from private aircraft, destroyed more than 35 square blocks of the district. At that time, it was the wealthiest black community in the whole entire United States, which was then called Black Wall Street. This massacre began during Memorial Day weekend after a 19-year-old Dick Rowland, a black shoe shiner, was accused of assaulting Sarah Page, who was a 17-year-old white elevator operator of the nearby Drexel building. He was taken into custody. After the arrest, rumors spread through the city that Rowland was to be lynched. Upon hearing reports that a mob of hundreds of white men had gathered around the jail where Rowland was being kept, a group of 75 black men, some of them were armed, arrived at the jail to ensure that Rowland would not be lynched. The sheriff persuaded the group to leave the jail, assuring that they had the situation under control. As the group was leaving the premises, complying with the sheriff's request, a member of the mob of white men allegedly attempted to disarm one of the black men. A shot was fired, and according to reports of the sheriff, all hell then broke loose. The Roswell Massacre was a racially motivated massacre of black people and a destruction of a black town that took place during the first week of January 1923 in rural Levy County, Florida. At least 6 black people and 2 white people were killed, though eyewitness accounts suggested a higher death toll of 27 to 150. The town of Rosewood was destroyed in what contemporary news report characterized as a race riot. Florida had especially high numbers of lynchings of black men in the years before the massacre, including a well-publicized event in December 1922. Before the massacre, the town of Rosewood had been a quiet, primarily self-sufficient whistle shop on the Seaboard Airline Railway. Trouble began when white men from several nearby towns lynched a black Rosewood resident because of accusations that a white woman in nearby Sumner had been assaulted by a black drifter. A mob of several hundred whites combed the countryside hunting for black people and burned almost every structure in Rosewood. Survivors from the town hid out several days in nearby swamps until they were evacuated by train and car to larger towns. No arrests were made for what happened in Rosewood, Florida. The town was abandoned by its former black and white residents. None ever moved back. None ever were compensated for their land, and the town had then ceased to exist. And then you have the period of Red Summer of 1919. So the Red Summer is the period from late winter through early autumn of 1919, during which white supremacist terrorism and racial riots took place in more than 3 dozen cities across the United States, as well as in one rural county in Arkansas. The term Red Summer was coined by civil rights activist and author James Weldon Johnson, who had been employed as a field secretary by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, since 1916. In 1919, he organized peaceful protests against the racial violence which had occurred that summer. In most instances, attacks consist of white-on-black violence. However, numerous African Americans also fought back, notably in Chicago and Washington, D.C. which resulted in 38 and 15 deaths, respectively, along with even more injuries and extensive property damage in Chicago. Still, the highest number of fatalities occurred in rural area around Elaine, Arkansas, where an estimated of 100 to 240 black people and 5 white people were killed, which was an event known as the Elaine Massacre. The anti-black riots developed from a variety of post-World War I social tensions, generally related to the demobilization of both black and white members of the United States Armed Forces following World War I. There was also an economic slump and increased competition in the job and housing markets between ethnic European Americans and African Americans. The time would be marked by labor unrest, for which certain industrialists used black people as strike bearers, further inflaming the resentment of white workers. The riots and killings were extensively documented by the press, which, along by the federal government, feared socialist and communistic influence on the black civil rights movement of that time, following the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. So the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia was when the Russian Empire, I think the Tsar, spelled Tsar, was overthrown by the Bolsheviks, and then they established the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, or the Soviet Union, or known as the formerly communistic Russia or Soviet Russia. They also feared foreign anarchists who bombed the homes and businesses of prominent business figures and governmental leaders. Fast forwarding a little bit, in addition, when Social Security was first created during the Great Depression, the Social Security Act of 1935 is a law enacted by the 74th U.S. Congress and signed into law by Democratic President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The law created a Social Security program as well as insurance against unemployment. The law was a part of Roosevelt's New Deal domestic program. It exempted agricultural and domestic workers, which disproportionately affected African Americans. 65% of African American workforce was excluded from the initial Social Security program, as well as 27% of white workers. Many of these workers were covered only later on, when Social Security was expanded in 1950 and then again in 1954. Consequently, the savings of retired or disabled African Americans was spent during old age instead of handed down, and households had to support poorly elder family members. Okay, moving on to real estate discrimination. The best ways usually to get wealth is to invest through real estate. Andrew Carnegie said it best that 90% of all millionaires had done so by investing in real estate. So, homeownership is a crucial means which families can actually accumulate wealth. Over a period of time, homeowners accumulate home equity in their homes. In turn, this equity can contribute substantially to the wealth of homeowners. Homeownership allows for the accumulation of home equity, a means of storing wealth, and provides family with insurance against poverty. 38.5% of the net worth of white homeowners and 63% of the net worth of African American homeowners. So 38.5% of the net worth of white homeowners and 63% of the net worth of African American homeowners. Now, there are large disparities in home ownership rates by race. In 2017, the home ownership rate was 72.5% for non-Hispanic whites and 42% for non-Hispanic blacks. The value of property has stifled during the history of the United States. Initially, when African Americans were still enslaved, they were forbidden of owning land and buildings, and those that could were able to own land and buildings for white Americans. As times passed by, so did the access to property, allowing African Americans to purchase property with within their financial needs. A prime example of how banks and organizations manipulate home ownership is by offering predatory loans. These loans target lower income individuals who are normally turned away from the banks and given lump sums on a ridiculous interest fee. These fees provide two outcomes for the individual. One, either they default on their payments and lose their property, or two, live the rest of their lives in debt. This ranges from everyday items such as automobiles and homes, which are more restricted to the individuals that needed it the most. So the Homeowners Refinancing Act, or the Homeowners Loan Act, or the Homeowners Loan Corporation Act of 1933 was an act of Congress that the United States had passed as part of Democratic President FDR's New Deal during the Great Depression to help those in danger of losing their home. The act which went into effect on June 13th, 1933, provided mortgage assistance to homeowners or would-be homeowners by providing them money or refinancing their mortgage. It also created the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or the HOLC building, on which built on Pervin Hoover's Federal Loan Bank Board. The corporation lent out low-interest money to families in danger of losing their homes to foreclosure. By the mid 1930s, the Hulk had refinanced nearly 20% of 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 urban homes in the country. Sorry about that for the stuttering. Moving on. The National Housing Act of 1934. So this was also called the Capehart Act, and the Better Housing Program was part of the New Deal passed during the Great Depression in order to make housing and home mortgages more affordable. This created the Federal Housing Administration, or the FHA, and the Federal Savings and Loan Incorporation, FSLIC. In 1934, the practice of redlining neighborhoods came into existence through the National Housing Act of 1934. This practice, also known as mortgage discrimination, began when federal government and the newly formed Federal Housing Administration allowed the HOLC to create residential security maps, outlining the level of security for real estate investments in 239 cities around the United States. On these maps, high-risk areas were outlined in red, high-risk areas being considered highly populated areas of African Americans and all other minority groups. If a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that property shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. The FHA's underwriting manual, that published in 1936, stated, a change in social or racial occupancy generally leads to instability and reduction in values. So the takeaway is that the FHA would not insure loans to Black Americans attempting to buy homes in primarily white neighborhoods. Many Black neighborhoods were redlined in these maps, meaning that banks would deny all mortgage capital to people living within them. Essentially, this contributed to the decay of many of these neighborhoods because of lack of loans for buying or making repairs to homes. Made it difficult for these neighborhoods to attract and keep 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 families. So many of urban historians point to redlining as one of the main factors of urban disinvestment and the decline of central cities in the middle decades of the 20th century. And then this rose into the Act of 1937. This piece of legislation occurred during the New Deal era and provided basic future public housing programs. It provided for subsidies to be paid from the U.S. government to local public housing agencies, or the LHA, to improve living conditions for the lower income families. This act allowed for the creation of around 160,000 units of public housing. Many of these units were made to alleviate the housing difficulties of the poor and working class suffer from the Great Depression. Additionally, this public housing program allowed for the FHA to provide various monetary funds to local housing authorities to aid with the building and development of these units. Despite providing low budget housing options, this act created greater racial segregation in housing because the majority of the poor population at that time consisted of Black residents. And then this also rolls us over to the Servicemen Readjustment Act of 1944, also commonly known as the GI Bill, that was signed into law by Democratic President FDR. Now, this piece of legislation was to provide benefits, including low-cost mortgages, lower interest loans to start a business or a farm, 1 year of unemployment compensation, and dedicated payments of tuition and living expenses to attend high school, college, universities, or a vocational school. These benefits were available to all veterans who had been on active duty during the war years for at least 90 days and had not been discharged other than honorable. So, at the end of World War II, the GI Bill further continued segregation practices by keeping African Americans out of European American neighborhoods, showing another side to African Americans' housing discrimination. When millions of GIs returned home from overseas, they took advantage of the Servicemen Readjustment Act, or the GI Bill. This important legislation was signed into law in 1944 by FDR and gave veterans education and training opportunities, guaranteed loans for homes, farms, or business, job finding assistance, and employment pay of $20 a week for up to 52 weeks if a veteran could not find a job. This law allowed millions of soldiers to purchase their homes with inexpensive mortgages, which meant the huge growth of the suburbs and the birth of the ideal of a suburban lifestyle. Now, African Americans were met with discrimination when trying to purchase a home in the overwhelmingly European American neighborhoods. The realtors would not show these houses to African Americans, and when they did, they would try to talk them out of buying a home. This discrimination was based on the fact that realtors believed they would be losing future business by dealing or listing with African Americans, that it would be unethical to sell a house in a European neighborhood to African Americans because they would drive the property values of the surrounding houses down. So both redlining and discrimination through the GI Bill regulated most African Americans to a concentrated area within the city. So the decline in property values and the higher crime rates could be kept in a contained area. The regulation of African Americans to the neighborhoods that were receiving no support due to redlining practices was a self-fulfilling prophecy that created the high slums that the city was afraid of. So essentially, this actually affects my family directly, at least on my mom's maternal side, because my second great grandfather, my mom's father, named Houston Shine, he was drafted into the Army on April 29th, 1943, at the age of 23. I verified this by the U.S. World War II Draft Corps Young Men 1940 to 1947 section, and I also verified this through the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs BIRLS Death File 1850 to 2010. And my great grandfather was not awarded the GI Bill because he was black and he was living in Arkansas, and Arkansas was a state that actually practiced Jim Crow discriminatory laws. If he was awarded that GI Bill, and then if he used it, he probably would have used it to a rental property since he was living with his father, my great great grandfather. And of course, real estate builds massive wealth, and that wealth probably would have trickled down to my grandmother, my mother, and myself in a way. And then this rolls us into the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which is a landmark law in the United States signed into law by U.S. President Lyndon Baines Johnson, or LBJ, Democrat, during the Martin Luther King Jr. assassination riots. But Title 8 through 9 are commonly known as the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which meant as a follow-up to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is a totally different legislation than the Housing and Urban Development Act of 1968, which expanded housing funding programs. While the Civil Rights Act of 1866 prohibited discrimination in housing, there were no federal enforcement provisions. Title 8 of the Civil Rights Act of 1968 is commonly referred to the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So since 1968, its protection has been expanded significantly by amendment. The Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity within the Department of Housing and Urban Development is charged with administering and enforcing this law. So the most comprehensive federal Fair Housing Act of its time, this piece of legislation mandated fair housing as a national policy and restricted discriminatory practices, specifically discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, national origin also included, was prohibited in the rental, sale, financing, and brokerage of housing or housing services. However, this act did not give the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, a lot of enforcing power. HUD was only allowed to mediate housing discrimination disputes between parties, but it did not have the power to file lawsuits or take definitive legal actions. And then shortly after this, you have Nixon's Fair Housing Policy of 1971. During his presidential term, Nixon's federal housing policy undermined the Fair Housing Act of 1968. His policy acknowledged that federal law requires non-discriminatory practices in federal housing matters, but it did not provide presidential support. Nixon declared that government could not force suburban desegregation or economic racial integration. In doing so, he secured many suburban votes, but further exacerbated the issue of housing inequality by supporting subsidized housing programs to help desegregation. Next up, you have the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974, which is a U.S. law enacted by Congress on October 28th, 1974. This law makes it unlawful for any creditor to discriminate against any applicant with respect to any aspect of credit transaction on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin, sex, marital status, or age, provided that the applicant has the capacity to contract. to the fact that all or part of the applicant's income derives from a public assistance program, or to the fact that the applicant has good faith exercise any right under the Consumer Credit Protection Act. So this law applies to any person who, in the ordinary course of business, regularly participate in the credit decision, including banks, retailer, bank card companies, finance companies, and credit unions. This legislation sought to prevent racial discrimination and appeared as though it worked, ended up being the bank just charged 8 times the higher rates for blacks. So this legislation sought to prevent racial discrimination, and although it did work, or although as it thought it would work, it ended up being the bank. They just charged 8 times higher interest rates just for blacks trying to get a home. And then next up, we have the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act of 1975. The Home Mortgage Disclosure Act of 1975, or HMDA or HMDA, is an act of Congress that requires certain financial institutions to provide mortgage data to the public. This law was signed by President Gerald R. Ford, Republican, like the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974. This piece of legislation was also designed to supplement the Fair Housing Act of 1968 in specific areas of housing discrimination. This act protected applicants for discrimination through lending institutions by requiring that any financial institution providing federally related mortgage loan disclose data annually. So this included reports of the amount and location of the loans related to federal housing by census tract or zip code. The purpose of this legislation was to prevent lending discrimination in certain localities. HMDA grew out of the public concern over credit shortages in certain urban neighborhoods. So Congress believed that some financial institutions had contributed to the decline of some geographic areas by their failure to provide adequate home financing to qualify applicants on reasonable terms and conditions. Thus, one purpose of HMDA and Regulation C is to provide the public with information that will show whether financial institutions are serving the housing credit needs of neighborhoods and communities in which they are located. A second purpose is to aid public officials in targeting public investments from the private sector to areas where they are needed. Finally, the FIRREA amendments of 1989 required the collection and disclosure of data about applicants and borrower characteristics to assist in identifying possible discriminatory lending patterns and enforcing anti-discrimination statutes. Unfortunately, that law did not do much because black Americans managed to collect their mortgages, but real estate agents proceeded to make it challenging for black Americans to actually obtain high-value homes. Real estate agents would show white Americans home-value homes while directing black Americans to lower-value homes. So a case study was done in 2012 by the Urban Institute showed that similar tactics are still being used in the present decade. A handful of black Americans who managed to acquire a mortgage were still steered towards purchasing low-value properties, thus accumulating poor value assets to build wealth, unlike our poor counterparts. The one factor that the median white American has at least 10 times the wealth than black Americans do. Moving on, you have the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977, signed into law by President James Carter, or you know him as Jimmy Carter, Democrat. The CRA, Community Reinvestment Act of 1977, encouraged commercial banks and savings associations to help meet the needs of borrowers in all segments of their communities, including low and moderate income neighborhoods. Congress passed this law to reduce discriminatory credit practices against low income neighborhoods, a practice known as redlining. This act instructs the appropriate federal financial supervisory agencies to encourage the regulated financial institutions to help meet the credit needs of the local communities in which they are chartered, consistent with safe and sound operation, which is Section 802. To enforce the statute, federal regulatory agencies examine banking institutions for CRA compliance. So essentially, that law also did not completely stop discriminatory practices, however. There's discrimination moved into more subtle techniques, including racial steering and misinformation given to African American prospective buyers. Although these laws exist in theory, they have not accomplished their goal of eradicating discrimination based on race in the housing market. Audits of the housing market in Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, and many other metropolitan areas have shown discrimination toward African Americans continuing into the 1980s, long after anti-discrimination laws were passed. Also, ProPublica carried out a study on Facebook in 2016. The investigation revealed that Facebook still provided racial options for sponsored posts. This allowed realtors to choose the rates that they want to advertise and sell. Facebook did not remove this racial option from their ads until 2019. So even in the more recent months or the recent years, the median home value in U.S. Neighborhoods that are less than 1% black is 300. It's at least 300,000. We're more than double the median home value in neighborhoods that are more than 50% black, about 150,000. According to a Brookings analyst of census data, an ACLU study shows that black homeowners suffer more greatly during the housing bust in 2008 or the 2007-2009 year, or the late 2000s. Whereas white homeowners saw their equity drop only 9.1% from 2007 to 2009, and another 2.2% from 2009 to 2011. But black homeowners' equity decreased from 11.9% and 5.6% respectively. And also, black homeownership rates also increased over the decades, but only at lower levels, from 22.8% in 1940 to 41.6% in 1970s, and upwards 43% to 44% in the 1980s and the 1990s, respectively. Data analysis by the Pew Research Center shows that 27.4% of black mortgage applicants were rejected in 2015, compared to 11% of white and Asian Americans. The most common reason black mortgage applicants were turned down as having a poor credit history, that was cited in 31% of the rejections. So 31% of the rejections, compared to 21% of the rejections for white applicants. And according to the Real Estate Act, Redfin, African American families have lost out on at least $212,000 in personal wealth over the last 40 years because of their homes were redlined. As a result of these policies, leave African American families with 10% of the net wealth of white families. Okay, moving on. This is actually going to be a more serious topic, and this topic is called benign neglect. So the concept of benign neglect was coined by the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Democrat of New York, in a January 1970 memo to President Richard M. Nixon, Republican, while he served as the latter's urban affairs counselor. So the widely circulated memo was leaked through the press in March of that same year, which read, "The time has come when the issue of race could benefit from a period of benign neglect." At that historical juncture, Moynihan declared Americans need a period in which Negro progress continued and racial rhetoric had a fade. Moynihan believed that the anti-poverty programs of the Great Society of the 1960s had failed miserably, not only because they had attempted to use the money alone to solve the nation's inability to properly educate the African American poor, but also because they did not raise issues in reference to the viability of integration as a solution to U.S. racial problems. To most liberals, especially many civil rights leaders of the period, Moynihan had provided the rationalization for what Swedish political economist Gunnar Myrdal, Gunnar G-U-N-N-A-R, Myrdal, M-Y-R-D-A-L, I think I pronounced it wrong, but still, in his classic An American Dilemma, he written in 1944, labeled a laissez-faire or a do-nothing approach to racial problems. Most liberals at that time, and they thought correctly, that Moynihan's concept was fatalistic. That is, the intervention of the federal government on behalf of African Americans could not alter the inexorable social forces that could only be assuaged by local initiatives. In short, the concept of benign neglect, for all intents and purposes, suggested that social programs that were endorsed and fully funded by the U.S. government created attitudes of dependency among the African American poor. In contradistinction to Moynihan's dire assessments, the research on anti-poverty programs conducted by persons such as Elizabeth B. Shore, Daniel Shore, Phoebe Cottingham, David T. Elwood, James Coleman, and many others which were based on substantive, empirically verified data, demonstrated that social programs were properly planned and executed, succeeded in reducing infant mortality and the incidence of low birth weight. Furthermore, programs such as the Head Start and Jobs Corps succeeded in helping to remedy such problems as chronic unemployment and poor school achievement, and aided in the prevention of teenage pregnancy. The aforementioned programs, which had their origins in LBJ Society initiatives, helped many African Americans break the cycle of disadvantage. In essence, the concept of benign neglect which was not based on empirical reality, ultimately blamed the victim and thus ignored the effects of the flawed structures of the society in this nation. So, nevertheless, there has been a recent revival of the benign neglect argument, which had resulted in the 1996 welfare reforms and the introduction of a rhetoric of a compassionate conservatism into the presidential campaign of 2000. Furthermore, conservative black politicians and spokespersons have promulgated variants of the concept, which rationalize a terrible, flawed social system. The Democratic opposition and liberals were quick to accuse Moynihan, a Democrat, and Nixon, a Republican, of racism. The memo claimed that crime rates were high in colored neighborhoods because African Americans felt alienated from society due to their antisocial lifestyle, like living in female-dominated households. And since fires are a good indication of a crime-filled area, Moynihan claimed that most fires in black neighborhoods were found to be cases of arson, not accidents. So critics thought benign neglect meant that firefighting teams were to ignore such neighborhoods as it was futile to fight arson. So, unlike the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense was a radical group known to use violent tactics. However, it was a nondescript organization until the Chicago police raided one of their offices, which gave them the fame they needed and earned them affluent donors. This was exactly what Moynihan intended to avoid. So, essentially, because of benign neglect, benign neglect is the reason why I think it's futile for black people to vote in these elections, especially for Democrats or let alone Republicans. Democrats use benign neglect to overlook solving black issues, even though 80% of blacks are Democrats and vote for them. But Malcolm X said in 1964 in his speech, The Ballot or the Bullet, the Democrats have been in Washington, D.C. only because the Negro vote. They've been down there for 4 years, and they and all other legislation they want to bring up, they brought it up and got it out of the way, and now they bring up you. And now they bring up you. You put them first, and they put you last because you're a chump, a political chump. And also Republicans, they are no better for black economic empowerment either. They want us to rely on laissez-faire free market capitalism and meritocracy, which they didn't use from 1783 to 1968 in order to generate wealth. Again, the GI Bill, the Housing Acts of 1930s, the Social Security Act, the Homestead Acts, not to mention President Trump signed an executive order for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders economic empowerment back in May 2019, which is called Executive Order 13872. Now, did mainstream media cover that particular executive order? So why do Asian American and Pacific Islanders get an economic empowerment plan? Did you hear about conservatives or the right-wing pundits talk about Executive Order 13872? But Republicans also want black people to practice individualism, which kind of goes against our natural culture belief of ethnic cohesion, which is why the concept of group economics resonates with most black people in the United States of America. So because of benign neglect, and now other groups are using the black plight to get their interests taken care of. So the term person of color, I don't like being referred to as a person of color, because originally you think it's supposed to mean a person who is white. To me, it actually is a code word for meaning undocumented illegal immigrants and refugees alongside their children who arrived after the signing of the Immigration Naturalization Act of 1965. Because when that law was signed, populations of immigrants coming to the country came increasingly from Asia, Africa, and Latin America instead of Europe. Since Western Europe they had an easy process to enter the United States. And same thing with the term minority. Minority, by its original definition, refers to a group of people who practices and culture and their cultural characteristics are lesser in numbers than the main groups of those classifications. Excuse me. But minority is used interchangeably with people of color, but essentially, in reality, minority actually means white women, because the women's struggles in the United States would then culminate into the feminist movement in the United States of America. Of course, women have their struggles. I'm not going to deny that, but a white woman's struggle and a black woman's struggle, it's not the same thing. It's just not the same thing. Then, of course, now you have the term marginalized group, which doesn't really mention gender or race. Um, it also includes religion, like Jewish people through anti-Semitism, and Arabs through Islamophobia, and sexual orientation through the anti-LGBTQIA+. And now you have Black and Brown Coalition, which I don't believe in. Whenever a representative AOC Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez is asked about reparations, she just benignly neglects her way through the conversation, or she'll speak in double speak, and then she'll say something like, "Well, who is black?" But yeah, she thinks Latino Hispanics are entitled to reparations, but she don't know who's black, but she know who would be a Latino and or who would or who is a Latino or a Hispanic, and she also believes that they are owed reparations. But whenever it talks about black people, whether it be reparations or restitution or an economic empowerment plan, she'll say, "Well, who is black? Who would qualify for that?" But she know who would qualify for Latino American or Hispanic American reparations, or their restitution of some sort, or their economic empowerment plan. Yet at the same time, black people love AOC. So essentially, brown folk benefit more from a black and brown coalition. For example, the DREAM Act, legislative proposal to grant temporary conditional residency with the right to work and all the other benefits. And they also have DACA, which is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival, which was an executive order or it's a governmental policy that allows some individuals with unlawful presence in the United States either being brought to the country as children to receive a renewable 2-year period of deferred action from deportation and to become eligible for a work permit in the U.S. So, of course, I don't believe in a black and brown coalition. And then again, more recently, a state fund was meant to help black Oregon residents and black-owned businesses in Oregon in order to navigate the COVID-19 pandemic. Is seeing mounted legal pressure because a judge had refused to stop the state from doling out money to black people in Oregon because that story said that one Mexican American filed suit because he felt that he was being discriminated since money was only being given to black people. But supposedly that there was a black and brown coalition, yet a Mexican American who is brown is suing Oregon because he's being discriminated against. But black people were supposed to believe in a black and brown coalition. So essentially, politics is war. It's going to be black people versus Hispanic people, black people versus white people, and black people against Asian people, including Indians, the Hindus, Sri Lankans, and whatnot. Again, with Chinese, Washington voters nearly rejected affirmative action in referendum 88, I think back in 2019. It's fairly recent. So throughout the campaigns, opponents of affirmative action, which were led by Chinese immigrants, said that the policy gives the government the power to discriminate. So they reject affirmative action for others, for black people, but they have no problem receiving affirmative action for themselves through President Trump's executive order 13872, the executive order on economic empowerment for Asian Americans and Pacific Islander Americans. So, the Chinese, they have ethnic cohesion makes them realize that it's in their best interest to remove affirmative action for their in-preference group. So essentially, with all this going on, I'm starting to believe that Democrats are allowing illegal immigrants or refugees and hope to make them citizens as fast as they can so they can render the black vote useless. And then And then black people don't want to be able to hold their vote hostage against Democrats for actual policy strictly for um, native blacks living in the U.S. And because of that, I don't vote myself. I rather vote with my wealth like these super PACs does. And then, of course, some will probably bring up Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. legacy for like fighting for integration and um, integration and voting. But activist Harry Belafonte said that MLK said that he feared that he is integrating his people into a burning house, which is us, black people, being integrated into a burning house, which is the United States, like fully. So essentially, I think the 1950s and the 1960s civil rights movement should have stopped at equal protection under the law. But fortunately, they pushed for integration, and then now look at where black people are from an economic standpoint. Because we don't practice aggregation unlike the Jews, Korean Americans, Chinese Americans, and other immigrants do. So, and then just like Malcolm X said in his Battle of the Bullet speech, and the white liberals who have been posing as our friends have failed us. And once we see all of that, these other sources to which we've turned have failed, we stop turning to them and then turn to ourselves. We need a self-help program, a do-it-yourself philosophy, a do-it-right-now philosophy, and it's already too late philosophy. This is what you and I need to go with. And the only way we're going to solve our problems is with a self-help program. Before we can get self-help programs started, we need to have a self-help philosophy. Black nationalism is that self-help philosophy. And then, of course, that comes from what that then leads into a book written by Dr. Claude Anderson called Powernomics. Powernomics, the plan to empower Black America. Powernomics. So essentially, just like what Dr. Claude Anderson wrote, is we need to practice ethno aggregation, which is the voluntary concentration of individuals and the resources around their ethnic language commonalities for the purpose of improving their economic and political competitiveness. We see it all the time with Chinatown, Koreatown, Little Italy, the Jewish communities, even with African immigrants like Little Mogadishu or Little Somalia, I think in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Of course, according to the book Powernomics, Powernomics. We'll start with our economic base, and then we'll move to the second floor. The second floor, which is politics, and then we'll be able to start lobbying for our special interests as Native Black people, because Israel, they already have their own political lobby, which is called the American Public Affairs Committee, APAC, which is a lobbying group that advocates for pro-Israel policies to Congress and to the presidency. And then on that, you also have the Human Rights Campaign, which is HRC, which is the largest LGBTQIA plus advocacy group and political lobbying organization in the United States. So Black people, we do not have a political lobbying group that is similar to APAC or the HRC. Again, the book Powernomics actually talks about buying up your politicians or lobbying to get what we want. And then what we really want is to reverse the Violent Crime and Law Enforcement Act of 1994, or the Clinton Anti-Crime Bill of 1994, or the Biden Anti-Crime Bill of 1994, and then abolish these private prisons, end the war on drugs, and then actually get a real Black agenda, very similar to what the Asian community got, which is again President Trump's Executive Order 1387-2 Executive Order, which was an executive order economic empowerment plan for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Again, all going back to the book Powernomics, the National Plan to Empower Black America, this book. And also, but then again, conservatives in the U.S., libertarians in the U.S., registered Republicans in the U.S., they are very critical of Blacks practicing ethno-aggregation because it contradicts the principle of just individualism. But just like how I said earlier, Jewish Americans, Italian Americans, Asian Americans, even sometimes I think Hispanic Americans, they do it most of the time by practicing ethno-aggregation, which to them, the bright ring in the United States, it goes against their concept of individualism. But Jewish Americans, Italian Americans, Korean Americans, they have their economic enclave, based off this book. Well, and then Dr. Claude Anderson, he wrote this book in order for us to practice ethno aggregation, and then we'll be competitive as a socio-economic group. Because they have, Chinatowns, Koreatowns, little Manilas, little Italy's, even little Ethiopia. But the moment that black people actually try to do something like that, people say it's racist, even though other ethnic groups, they do that. But I don't know. Anyway, my next video will start to be a series on how to build wealth in the United States of America and how I actually build wealth myself. Of course, I do support an economic empowerment plan similar to Executive Order 13872, the economic empowerment plan for Asian Americans and Pacific Islander Americans, but that version strictly for the non-Hispanic Black Americans because of the historic economic discrimination that I actually spent almost the last hour talking about. Because as individuals, we really do need to proactively build wealth through bootstrapping. No pun intended. Without the external help or working capital. Of course, I will always believe in us having an economic empowerment plan very similar to Executive Order 13872, but we actually need to look into ourselves and then actually pull our resources together and then go by Dr. Claude Anderson's book, Powernomics, the Plan to Empower Black America. And then we're actually going to keep doing those steps. And then most of our problems, at least economically, should be a lot better than it is today. Again, this is Dawson Discussions. My name is Nathan O. Dawson Jr. And stay tuned for my next video. All right, take care and have a nice day.